Good afternoon and welcome to the Huxley Speaker Series. Blustery day here in Bellingham. My name is Stefan Freeland. I am the coordinator of the series, and as usual we'll have time for questions at the end of the talk, so you can submit those via the chat or the Zoom Q&A, and we'll get to as many of those as we have time for. Today it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Darcy Matthews. Dr. Matthews is a assistant professor over at University of Victoria, so across the water. He is an ethnoecologist and an archaeologist who works in collaboration with the First Nation peoples communities there to understand the deep history of social and ecological relationships between past peoples and their environments. And we will hear a bunch more about that. Darcy, please join us and welcome.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm just going to share my screen.
That looks great.
Everybody can see that okay? So thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I'm such a fan of the work that you were all doing over there. And I really took this as an opportunity to share some of the research that we've really begun in the last couple of years and really is evolving. And so the title of my talk today is Relatives of the Deep, the Ethnoecology of the Lekwungen Archipelago in the Salish Sea. And before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from the University of Victoria. It's on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, the present-day Songhees and Esquimalt nations. And my talk today, and the research that I'm doing and that my graduate students and I and our community partners are doing, is really exploring the stewardship of the Lekwungen people at this archipelago of Tl'ches. And I would like to acknowledge that I've been very generously and kindly entrusted with sharing some of this story with you today. I'd first like to acknowledge Saflama. Saflama is an elder or a Salish of the Songhees Nation. And she is very much she provides the guiding principles, the core values, the protocols that we do to follow our work. And I'm going to spend part of my talk today talking about Saflama and her life at Tl'ches, because it's really how our research has begun there. I'd also like to acknowledge other knowledge holders, including the late Skip Sam and his wife May. I'd like to thank very kindly and generously Chief Ron Sam and the Songhees Nation, folks on council and in their lands management departments for helping to build this momentum as we move towards these research projects at Tl'ches. And I'd also like to thank community partners, people like Cheryl Bryce and Kathy Bryce, Wilfred George, Darlene Joseph, who generously provide their guidance and their time and enthusiasm and laughter for the work that we're doing together at Tl'ches. Here's a picture of the late Skip Sam and Wilfred at Tl'ches a few years back. And so in partnership with the Lekwungen-speaking peoples of the Songhees Nation and guided by Saflama, our research applies traditional ecological knowledge and archaeological methods and theoretical approaches. Some of us have grounding in ecology and ecological sciences and pedology or soil science and ethnobotanical methods and so on. And we've come together to investigate how Lekwungen plant stewardship and the inhabitation of these places like Tl'ches has really profoundly shaped these ecosystems over millennia. And this is building upon some really excellent work, including some of the people in the audience, that people have been doing around clam gardens. And this clam garden work has really brought to the forefront and I think shaped people's perceptions around the scale and the scope and the magnitude of Indigenous management of ecosystems, in that case, intertidal ecosystems. But by extension, one of the things that we haven't looked at in a lot of detail are the more terrestrial ecosystems through the same kind of suite of tools, of collaborative and complementary tools. And this is the work that we're taking, this is the approach we're taking in our work at Tl'ches together. And so we've been working at Tl'ches for about 3 years now and doing this community-based and transdisciplinary research. And I use the term transdisciplinary very carefully and specifically because what I mean here is that we are approaching Tl'ches addressing the concerns that the community have for this place, and also following the values and the protocols and the guidance that the community that offers. And in turn, we as social scientists and other scientists are in turn bringing our expertise, and these are brought together on equal footing to approach this place that we all love and try and understand something of the deep history of ecological management of the island. But of course, there's a sense of urgency around this with climate change and other factors. And so we'll touch upon all of those today. We have a number of things that we are looking at, issues that we're looking at Tl'ches, but I want to focus on two today. And I'm focusing on two because there's never enough time. But this is also an opportunity for me to introduce you to two of my graduate students and the excellent work they're doing. And I've realized, I've been an assistant professor now for 4 years. I've learned that I'm just now living vicariously through my graduate students. And I drive the boat and take care of the logistics while they do the real work. I get to help sometimes. But there are two topics that I really want to focus on. We're really looking towards understanding Coast Salish soils. And we're looking at the ecological legacies of Lekwungen root gardening. And I'm going to define and talk about each of those in more detail. So I'd first of all like to introduce you to Tl'ches. And I should also say that Sathalama would have liked to have been here today, and she was going to join us. But as she told me just an hour ago, she's like, Darcy, I really hate Zoom. But she is here in spirit, and I went over this presentation with her last night. And anyway, she sends her regards to all of you. She calls Tl'ches her home. And Tl'ches is an archipelago. It's a low-lying archipelago. It's really only about 1.5 kilometers southeast of Victoria. So from Uvik, if I just walk down to the end of the main road that goes by Uvik, and I go down to the water, it's just a 5-minute walk. I look across the water, and that's what I see. I see Tl'ches. And it's an archipelago of 3 sort of larger islands and then 7 smaller islets. But even then, these islands aren't particularly large. Little Chatham, as it's called here. This is the kind of island that you could walk around in about an hour. This is a picture of Tl'ches, and this is actually the location on this awesome map, my favorite map, showing the location of where I'm talking about today. Some of you may be familiar with the story of Tl'ches. Tl'ches is the coastal wolf who up until recently was a resident of the island and a companion out there. And Sathalama would like to dedicate today's talk to the memory of Tl'ches, who unfortunately died last year. The word Tl'ches is the name of the islands. In Lekwungen, it means the island. And it's a derivative of the word Tl'ches, or island. And I've been learning Sinchothan, which is a very closely related language to Lekwungen. They're very much complementary languages with much in common. And my Sinchothan teacher, Linda Elliott, she says that we call islands relatives or ancestors of the deep. The creator threw people into the ocean and islands formed, and you take care of your relatives. You take care of those places and they will take care of you. And so this concept of these islands being relatives or ancestors of the deep is a really beautiful sentiment to describe this place that has been really shaped by a long history or deep history of Lekwungen inhabitation and stewardship. It's the place where the first salmon ceremony originated, according to the late ethnographer Diogenes. And this is a ritual that honors these historical relationships between humans and salmon. Adam Olson, who's a member of the Salish Nation and also a member of our local Green Party, he very eloquently describes this respectful relationship between each fisherman and the salmon in this way. He says the wealth of the Straight Salish reef netter was not counted by the number of sockeye he could catch, preserve, or trade alone. It was also calculated by the long-term quality and abundance of the fishing grounds he owned, he cared for, and passed down to his descendants. This relationship was central to the way of life of a reef netter. Rather than viewing the sockeye as a resource to be exploited in full, reef netters believed the fish, like every other living being, was once a human, and that all living things are an integral part of the circle of life. The sockeye that passed by our nets were honored as sacred lineages. no different than the lineages of reef netters, both part of the same cycle. And it's these values of respect, of reciprocity, of kincentricity that are foundational to not only reef net fishing, but I think to every other venue of stewardship that the Lekwungen people and Salish people here in Victoria practice and have practiced for a long time. And certainly these values extend to their relationships with these culturally important root foods. Importantly, Tl'ches is the last non-urban place that the Songhees Nation has. It's their reserve land, it's undeveloped. There's no houses out there today, although there certainly were houses historically and deep into the past. And for many people at Songhees today, they're at this juncture of deciding what Tl'ches means to them and how they approach the islands. And for many people that I'm working with, that these islands are really a repository of traditional knowledge. Sathlama describes Tl'ches as a healing place, like a library or a classroom, that it connects us with our history, our ancestors, the Salish, and our other relations. And Sathlama, she was raised at Tl'ches. She was raised by her great-grandparents, Tom and Alice James, and she was taken out there by her grandparents so that she wouldn't have to go to residential school. And she was able to escape that system until she was 10. And Tom and Alice, along with a handful of other folks, were the last residents of Tl'ches. And in 1953, they had to leave because the wells ran dry, and they went back to the community. Sathlama is the last living resident of Tl'ches. And so the work that we're doing has a sense of urgency because she wants to find these answers, and she wants to see as much progress. She wants to see make as much progress as we can, and make sure that, that things are proceeding on course. And so our partnership with Sathlama and with the Songhees Nation revolves around Sathlama's situated knowledge. And she has a very clear vision for the islands and its future. Tl'ches has always historically been a place of learning and of healing. And Tom and Alice were both healers themselves. Sathlama tells us that getting the youth back to the land is really her priority, caring for our traditional foods and remembering our history. And she describes Tl'ches as a paradise with the Salish, with the old ones. It's my home. And I should also say that Tom James, here he's 99 years old in this photo. He died at age 103. That Sathlama was raised by people who were themselves very young when the first settlers arrived. So Sathlama is a knowledgeable leader in her community. She's certainly been a visionary for cultural renewal and certainly the ecological restoration on the islands. This is a photo of Sathlama, and we're going to come back to this photo if there's enough time. This is Sathlama when she's 3, sitting with her grandmother who bore the name Sathlama before it was passed on to Sathlama when she was older. And this is the house at Tl'ches. And she really longs to see the restoration of traditional intertidal foods, of root gardens, of orchards, and also the more traditional root gardens that, that her and her family got their food from. So they grew potatoes, and they had, carrots and peas and apples and so on, but they were also eating Pacific crabapple, they were eating camas and chocolate lily and so on. And so Sathlama wants her people to know their history, be proud of it, and she views archaeology as a means for her community to discover this history. And that Tl'ches really is this library, this place of teaching that we can access some of this more traditional knowledge and teaching. It is one of the archetypal sites for this term, a cultural keystone place. It's a variegated coastline of shingle beaches and salt marshes and rocky headlands. It's also a very complex ecological mosaic of coastal bluffs, of meadows, woodlands, vernal pools, lagoons, and wetlands. And it also has some of the best examples of shallow soil garryoak ecosystems. And these are certainly places that have quite an impression of what is very likely intensive Indigenous management over long periods of time. So there's evidence of fire, and you can see in this photograph here, I'm going to talk about this meadow in a minute, you can see just the amount of chocolate lily in this field, despite the invasive grasses. These are the kinds of plants here that were managed, I think, in very significant numbers. And there are also a very significant number of archaeological sites. So Tl'ches, when Elaine and Nancy and Diego and others wrote this paper about cultural keystone places, they defined it as a given site or location of high cultural salience for one or more groups of people, which plays or has played in the past an exceptional role in a people's cultural identity as reflected in their day-to-day living, food production, and other resource-based activities, land and resource management, language, stories, history, social and ceremonial practices. And Tl'ches very much encapsulates that totality, and it's that we're trying to access when we approach the islands. As an archaeologist, of course, I've worked up and down the coast of British Columbia for a long time now, 25 years. And Tl'ches is really the place that I've been most excited. And so when Saflama invited me a while back to come and join her on the islands and do this work, I really dropped everything I was doing to make this happen. There are 46 archaeological sites that have been recorded on the islands. Most of them are only really minimally recorded. And so we're really at the process right now of conducting these archaeological inventories. And Little Chatham, which is this island here, Shnang is the Lekwungen word, is the focus. I'm going to talk about that island today. It's really where we've begun. And we've begun there because that's the island where Saflama was raised. And it also has 2 of the 3 very largest villages that we've found so far. It's also has burial cairns, Douglas fir, culturally managed trees, and lithic sites, which I can't really talk about today, another time perhaps. It also has edible camas and chocolate lily in abundance. So you can see this picture here is just an example of that. Here's Wilfred George, and Will is holding up some rhizomes from springbank clover and Pacific silverweed. So I'm going to talk about that. It also has seabird nesting rocks and clam beds. Marco Hatch came out a year and a half ago, and there are no clam gardens there, but there are certainly lots of clam beds. There are Pacific crab apples and Western yew that, at least spatially, are associated with village sites. And so there's lots of work that we're doing there. And then there are also many other sites associated with the harvesting of crabs, sea urchins, marine algae, and fish, of course. And so when we began this work, one of the things that we wanted to do right away was, of course, determine shared research questions and priorities. And so working with the community and under the guidance of Slayoak, like Saflama, Skip Sam, and community leaders like Chief Ron Sam and other community members, we had a series of consultations where we wanted to sort of bring together our hopes and dreams for the island, and also match to the best of our ability the skill sets that we have, and also to find additional people, additional experts to bring in to answer some of these questions. And there are a couple of values that immediately came to the minds of people in the community, and one is ecocultural restoration and the restoration of traditional foods. I mean, I'm an archaeologist, I'm not a restoration expert, but I'm certainly learning. But here in the School of Environmental Studies, we certainly do have lots of restoration experts here. Another part of this was about creating opportunities for youth to be grounded both in traditional knowledge and in sciences. And Tl'ches is really the best place where we can bring youth from the community. They have opportunity to work with their Salish and other knowledge holders in the community, but also hang out with scientists and participate in the work. And unfortunately, we had a grant in place to really do a lot of that this past summer, and COVID has sort of thrown a monkey wrench in there. But anyway, we'll get back to it. And another part of this also has to do with answering very specific questions. So Saflama, for example, she remembers going down to the beach and harvesting squeetsy. and hiquas, and these are a green and purple urchin. And there are those, neither of those animals is visible in those places today. And so one of the first projects we did, and I'll talk about that perhaps another time, is we actually used an underwater drone. One of our ES graduate students did that. And, we were able to do underwater transects and take an underwater inventory of the islands. We did find hiquas and squeezy. There's not much left, probably due to commercial harvesting, but the information there has been fed and contributed to a marine use plan. And so what we're trying to do is collect ecological and archaeological knowledge, combine that with community knowledge, and also then create policies that will shape and inform the protection of the islands through time. One of the things that is of deep concern to everybody are these threatened sites. And so in particular, coastal archaeological and TUS sites are at high risk due to projected increased storminess and sea level rise. And of course, exacerbated by things like large ship traffic and trespassers and folks like that are really a problem. And so when we first began, I just did a really basic GIS simple flooding analysis. I just raised sea level 17 meters as just a really kind of rough exercise or a heuristic to look at projected sea level rise by 2100. There's certainly quite a bit more robust and sophisticated modeling required, but even just this basic sort of analysis really points to pretty significant impact to most coastal archaeological and TUS sites. And so it was determined through consultation with the community that these archaeological sites, these coastal sites, should be inventoried, and particularly 3 large village sites. And that we should be looking at the ethnoecology of traditional root foods and soils, and at these ecological legacies of this Indigenous management. So there are 3 topics that we are looking at right now. The first 2 I'm not going to talk about today because those are the 2 that are less developed. One has to do with establishing the contemporaneity of human habitation in the study area and building a chronology. And that's of course just pretty standard archaeology. I'm pretty excited to do that, of course, as a stones and bones archaeologist. But also understanding the fire history, which of course is a very well-known management practices, both spatially and temporally in relation to these village sites are key questions. But really the 2 that we're focusing on right now, and these are the 2 questions that 2 of my graduate students and I are working on, is first to quantify the ecological legacies and resulting long-term effects on the composition of plant communities around villages. So this has to do with Indigenous management, Lekwungen management, and to categorize the effects of human interventions, such as inhabitation and cultivation on soil formation processes, with particular emphasis on the development of anthropogenic soils over time. And so we're looking at 2 sites on Little Chatham. Isabel Maurice Hammond is a doctoral student. And so she's looking at the soils and the plant communities on the north end of the island. And this is a coastal root garden. It's a small lagoon and it has springbank clover and Pacific silverweed. And so I'm going to share some information that Isabel is currently working on. And Emma Lowther is a MSc student, and she is working on the south side. And she is looking at a site that is a very complex mosaic of chocolate lily and greater and common camas, blue camas. It also has archaeological house depressions. It's got Pacific crabapple trees and burial cairns. So I'm going to talk a bit about both of those places and highlight a bit of the work that Emma and Isabel are doing. So first of all, looking at the south end, this is just an aerial view of this area. It's about 150 meters from there to there, so it's not a very big area. But what we see here is we see 2 very large house depressions, and these house depressions are almost certainly pre-European contact. They're about 48 meters long and about 18 to 20 meters wide. They're 2 parallel deep depressions. The community didn't know about that. We cleared blackberry out of there, and of course, to an archaeological eye, they pop right out. Surrounding this is not the sort of classic kind of shell midden that you see associated with some of these villages, but it's this black soil, this black earth. And I'm going to talk about that because I think there's something real. There's an interesting story there with this kind of dark earth that is ubiquitous, not just Tl'ches, but also throughout the region. Adjacent to it is this large meadow. This is where that chocolate lily and blue camas grows so prolifically. And there are burial cairns off to the side. And this is a pattern that we see play out time and again. I've been working here for a long time, and in my PhD and my master's work and in my postdoctoral work as well, we see this pattern where we have a village site associated with dark earth. We see adjacent areas where there are blue camas and other culturally important plants like chocolate lily growing. The bulbs of both of these plants are really important carbohydrate, as well as blue camas in particular is really important for regional trade. And then we see adjacent to that are burial cairns, and there's a funerary space associated with that. And so the question that we are approaching the soils part of this research with is whether or not Lekwungen people were intentionally enhancing or making soil to promote culturally important plant growth. Now, in previous work that I've done with some of my colleagues here in ES, such as Andrew Trant, who's at Waterloo now, and Brian Strzomski, and a few other folks, we published a paper a few years ago in Nature Communications looking at archaeological sites on the central coast of British Columbia. And we found that the things like calcium and phosphorus and nitrogen, that when people bring those to archaeological sites or village sites, that they often enhance tree growth. And that wasn't the intended outcome or consequence of this. But at the same time, those are limiting factors in a coastal temperate rainforest, and that human presence results in these trees growing super well. But there is a really developed body of research in the Amazon that maybe many of you are familiar with. In particular, this idea of terra preta, and these are these Amazonian dark earths. These are types of dark earths that were originally thought to be the unintended consequence of people living in a place, and that produces these amazing soils. But increasingly, it becomes apparent that people were aware that their inputs into the soil were having pretty significant effects on the quality of the soil in terms of growing their culturally important foods. Dana Lepovsky, my colleague at SFU, one of the folks she worked with, I believe up in Gigek territory, called these archaeological soils a gift from the ancestor. And so I should also say that these kinds of dark earths are pretty ubiquitous, not just in the region. And so soil surveys in the 1950s and 60s identified huge parts of Victoria as these dark earths. But of course, for those of us that do archaeology, this dark, really dark, organic, rich, kind of greasy material is really common at archaeological sites, and that's what we see here. So this work has really the potential to highlight not just the role of Lekwungen people in shaping their soils here, and these soils are very, very productive, but also by extension, perhaps much more broadly across the Northwest Coast. And so what Emma is doing, she's doing a few things, but one of the things she's doing is she's conducting a series of evaluative test units, 50 by 50 centimeter units, where we're beginning at these house depressions and moving northwest through the site. And we're looking at, or she's looking at the gradient between the shallowest midden and doing some tests right in the house floors as well as in the berm between the two neighbors. And then this kind of gradient between the shallowest midden into where these chocolate lily and blue camas plants grow in such proliferation. Suthlama, we were there last summer walking through the meadow. Suthlama tells us this is where her relatives were harvesting blue camas and where she did as a child as well. So we take it at face value that this is in fact a garden. And so what we're doing is we're looking at the transition, or this gradient in terms of the quality or the attributes of the sediment or soil between village and field. And then of course we have control sites that we're comparing these against also. Just to give you a visual idea of what this looks like. So here we are, we're standing sort of at the south part of that site. I'm standing right in house depression number 2. This berm is this soil that separates the two houses, these sort of long parallel-sided houses. There's a nice Pacific crabapple growing in the middle of this, very important culturally important tree. And then here's that camas and chocolate lily field. There's Emma in her happy place, digging some of her units. And over here in this area is where we see the burial cairn. So really not a very big area at all, but there's a lot happening here. And you can see that, again, here's the proliferation of chocolate lily, and a little bit earlier that same year, you can see the chocolate lily a bit smaller, and the camas really blooming in proliferation. There's lots of other culturally important plants in here. There is nodding onion and hooker's onion, and there is cuckmine. It's a Lomatia ethnoecology. It's a really important medicinal plant. I just used the last of my cuckmine today. I have a sore throat. So anyway, the cuckmine helps with that. And so when we talk about the archaeology of Lekwungen soils, we have a couple of hypotheses that we're testing. And these are attributes that are characteristic of anthrosols in places like Amazonia or other places with dark earths. And just so we're all clear, by anthrosol, what I mean is anthro, people, and sol, soil. These are soils that have been modified, or in some instances, like Terra Preta, intentionally made by people. And so we're looking at this gradient between the houses and the house floors themselves and the transition into the fields. And then, of course, we have control sites around. The control sites we're still working on. This is work that really is happening right now. The control sites are tricky. And this is something, that for those of us who are doing this kind of work is like, what is a control site? Because a lot of Tl'ches sure has the hallmarks of this kind of management. So anyway, we're still trying to, we haven't dug our control sites yet. So here are a couple of attributes that we expect for anthrosols, Lekwungen anthrosols, if these in fact are what they are. First of all, we know in reading the ethnographies and talking with experts like Safloma that these cultivated fields, that these camas and other chocolate lily and other important plant fields are often adjacent to the village. They are proximal, either beside or behind, but often immediately to the side. And that's certainly the case in this meadow, that we expect there to be dark coloration. And again, this is pretty classic, sort of what archaeologists very loosely and broadly call shellless midden. And this kind of soil is also very ubiquitous around Victoria. We expect there to be poor compaction and poor micro or macro stratification, because we know that when camas and chocolate lily were being managed and being harvested, that they were using digging sticks. And actually, I brought my digging stick today. And so here's an example of a digging stick if you haven't seen one. And these were inserted into the ground and wiggled back and forth so that the camas bulbs or the rhizomes from stringback clover could be pulled out without breaking them. And so we expect there to be poor compaction, and we measure this with a soil penetrometer, which measures compaction, and also poor macro stratification, because as the soils or sediments are being turbated through digging roots, we'd expect quite a bit of mixing in the sort of the upper and lower strata. And there also has been a period of time, a generation. So some soils have formed in situ, but generally we would expect to see not really strong soil horizonation. So we're looking both at the sediment and the soil in situ. This would be contrasted with those house floors, which are immediately adjacent to it, which have very compacted house floors, compacted not just naturally, of course, but by people, generations of people walking back and forth. It creates really compacted hard surface. We tried initially to use an ESP core to collect some samples, and the ESP core just bounced off. So we're doing it by hand. And of course, those sediments are highly stratified. They are the kinds of layers that we typically find in archaeological sites. We also hypothesize that in these fields that we'll see elevated soil organic matter. And so these are samples that we're collecting now. Also, we expect to see a lot more charcoal. And this is because these fields are strongly associated with burning. They were sites that were focal points for burning. Also, we expect there to be other anthropological inputs that would result in soil in the ground. In the case of Terra Preta, it appears that Amazonian folks were putting charcoal or char into the soils because it has beneficial effects. This is really I don't have time for this, but I do have to mention that I have a student who I'm also working with, microbiologist, and we're actually looking at some of the microbial communities in these charcoal samples. And certainly it appears that garden sites will have much more robust kinds of microbial communities because they, of course, contribute to soil health and soil productivity. But that work is really in its infancy, so maybe I'll talk about that later some other time. We also expect to see elevated levels of phosphorus compared to control sites. And so, well, potassium and nitrogen and calcium, we expect people, typically where people live and where people are, those tend to be high in the soil, but they are affected by leaching, and we're aware that they're affected by plant uptake through time and so on. But phosphorus, in particular, its common long-lasting form, or its common form of phosphate, is largely immobile in the soil, and it's very long-lasting. So we are testing phosphate levels right now. We've actually got some samples to the lab. Of course, we are expecting artifacts. So this is associated any place with intensive human presence. And so you can see that the upper 30 centimeter levels, this is in the field. And even though we're away from the house at this point, we've still got charcoal, lots of charcoal. We've got fire altered rocks, and we've got the bulbs of Hooker's onion as well. So we're really looking at things that have been there for a long time, chemical and structural signatures of soil that have been there for a long time, but also the ecological remnants of cultivation, of management. And these are places that haven't been actively managed in a generation, yet these plants are still proliferating. And of course, there's invasive species and other issues to address. The other project that Isabel is working on, again, at the other end of the island, and this is a drone eye view of the garden. Marco Hatch, if he's here, he knows how much I love my drone. And so here we are looking towards this garden. And so what we have here is we have this shelf of peat. And when I first started working at Tl'ches, this was one of the first places that we put ashore. And I was walking around and I noticed, first of all, that the beach here is covered. This entire beach is thermally altered rock, or fire broken rock, which tells me that people are doing a lot of pit cooking or cooking of root foods. And really every single one of these rocks, you can actually see even from this distance that the rocks have a reddish tinge to them. So there's over here, there's a small little shell midden, certainly not a village site. It's probably associated with a small sort of seasonal camp. So a lot of the pieces point towards, archaeologically point to this area as an intensively used place. And the other thing, of course, I just luckily came here in the spring, and this little meadow is full of springbank clover and Pacific silverweed. And the rhizomes of both of these plants are important. They're important kind of root foods, even though the rhizomes, but they're important foods. And there are places around Victoria where we know historically these were important, but they're all gone. And perhaps the best known, and this place was actually described by James Douglas, who was one of the first settlers here in Victoria. And this place, Clover Point, is still called Clover Point today. It's now largely a parking lot or a scenic loop, one and the same. The clover's all gone, but of course, James Douglas and others talked about this rich and luxuriant sort of massive field of clover, which was important to the Lekwungen people. As far as I know, this is the last clover patch, clover garden in Victoria. We find Pacific silverweed in other places, including places that are poly gardens, but clover is disappearing. And I talked with Nancy Turner, ethnobotanist, and Nancy's been out here with Saflama and I many times. And Nancy actually came to this spot here in the late 1980s with Saflama, and the amount of clover has really disappeared. So what we're doing is we're certainly trying to understand the ecology of the clover and the relationship that clover and silverweed have to one another in a managed garden like this, but also, as it's competing with sedges and other plants. So Isabel's been doing shore normal line transects through here. She's been doing ecologically sampling here, as well as at 3 other control sites at Tl'ches. and looking at the plant communities along the gradient of these transects. She certainly noticed that this site is very unique in first of all, the presence of clover, but also the density of clover and of silverweed itself. Isabel's also been doing soil sampling along these at all sites and transects. So she's looking at the soil chemistry as well as the structural aspects of this as well. I should also say, I think I forgot to mention this on the last slide, that Emma's also doing the micromorphology. She's an archaeologist and a micromorphology specialist by training. She got her training at SFU. So she's also looking at the micromorphology, because we expect very different sort of microscopic characteristics to these structures as well. We should expect to see the infiltration of charcoal and other materials like that deeper into the stratigraphic column, for example. Isabel, as part of, she's doing soil sampling, but we don't want to impact these places very much. So when we are doing our soil sampling, we're also treating those as little archaeological excavations. So we're actually, and we're also treating them as ecological experiments. I'll come back to that in a second. But as we are excavating those units along the line transects, we are actually finding cultural material in there. So we're finding fire broken rock and lots of charcoal, but also finding things like a shoe nail. And these are the kind of tack, a shoe tack, that was really common in the 1800s, around the time when we know that Chemek, who was Sahlama's great-grandma, was here using the garden. One of the things we're hoping for is, because this is peat and it's waterlogged, we're hoping to find the tip of a digging stick tip. And certainly there have been places in British Columbia where that's been found, like Pit Polder over on the Lower Mainland. No luck yet, but we still have work to do there. And so as we are digging these units and we're collecting soil samples, column samples, and so on to look at these macro and micro and chemical signatures of the soil, we're also using this as an opportunity, because we know we're disturbing this, that we are separating out the sedges, we're separating out the competing species, and pulling out the springbank clover and Pacific silverweed rhizomes, and then replanting them. And one of the things that we noticed is that over the last couple of years, that the clover in particular has really flourished in these samples. So we were really reluctant to do any ground disturbance here at all, for fear of endangering the clover, but it actually looks like the areas where you can see these little square square-shaped plumes of clover doing super well in these gardens, which is encouraging for future ecological restoration projects. Oops. I don't want to take too much more time, so I'm just going to say that so what we're doing is we're deriving a lot of our research hypotheses from community knowledge, from ethnographies. And so, for example, we're looking here at past actions or cultivation activities, and we are looking at things that we could potentially measure and that should leave lasting impressions or impacts, and the methods that we're going about doing it. So we know that at coastal root gardens like this, and learning from Nancy Turner and Doug Dewar, who did some really phenomenal work with the Lake Quaxistala with Clan Chief Adam Dick up in Kwakwaka'wakw territory, that the Lokiwe, these springbank clover and Pacific silverweed gardens there were places, they were called, the name itself means places of manufactured or human-made soil. And so what we're doing, and one of the key things that they did there was fertilizing those gardens with organic matter, with soil organic matter. And so we are expecting the increase of certain key nutrients, in particular phosphorus, but also nitrogen, carbon, calcium, potassium, magnesium, and sulfur. And so we are doing a suite of multi-elemental soil analyses. And so we're just waiting for some of our results there. We do have some preliminary results that certainly nitrogen and phosphorus are higher. Because these are places that are subject to tillage, the regular turning over or mounding of soil, and in this case, potential terracing, we are expecting lower levels of compaction. So we're measuring that relative to control soils with soil penetrometers. And one of the things that we noticed right away is that when we began our testing, we began towards the seaward edge of the garden. And it is an impenetrable mat of peat. It is really hard to excavate through that. We were pretty unhappy after digging through that for a day or two. But as we started moving inland, what it appears to be is there appears to be a sort of an armory or a kind of thin shelf. It's probably only about 1 meter wide, a very, very thick, impenetrable, virtually impenetrable peat. And then immediately after that, it drops off into this luxuriant black, sort of fluffy kind of soil, the kind of soil that I aspire to as a gardener in my own garden. So one of the things that we're hypothesizing is that they weren't putting log walls or stone terraces here like they did in Kwakwaka'wakw territory, but what they're doing is they're actually excavating out with digging sticks perhaps, leaving that peat layer on the outside and then essentially creating sort of an armored area on the inside of the peat. So anyway, we still have lots of work to do there. I just wanted to report that to you because I think it's really, really neat. And so we're also, again, looking for stone and wooden tools and so on in there, as well as evidence of terracing. And then also we should see evidence of selective weeding or even transplanting. And so we should then see a heightened relative abundance of these target species, clover and silverweed, changes in overall species richness in the landscape, which we are definitely seeing. And this is being accomplished by shore perpendicular line transects and quadrat sampling. All right, I love this photo. This shows one of those partially done excavation units, and you can see here just how much clover and silverweed are in each of these gardens. And one of the clover rhizomes we pulled out was 6 feet long. So some of these, they just hit the hard pan at the bottom and grow laterally. Our archaeological excavations that we've done there, we found the shoe nail, we found fire-cracked rock, we found a small assemblage of lithic materials, like the byproducts of people sharpening stone tools. We have a radiocarbon date of 510 to 426 calibrated years BP. So that's pretty neat. We don't know if that's associated with the garden, but it's a basal date from charcoal at the bottom of the garden. And again, we're just using these, when we fill these back in, we're separating out the sedges, which seem to be the number one sort of plant that's competing with these two. And we're now measuring we're measuring now how clover and silverweed are doing. Isabel could speak to that with a little bit more detail than I can. All right, and I'd like to just conclude my talk because I'm an archaeologist, and this is something I was doing last summer. And Saflama, we went to the islands last year, and she said, Darcy, I would love to know about the archaeology of my family. And so what we did is, this area is largely overgrown today. A lot of invasives have come in, so lots of blackberries and so on, but you can still see, you know, there are the apples and plum trees that she so fondly remembers. And so what I did is these are an air photo from 1930, and you can see here, here's the house that Saflama grew up in. Here's the house that the two Saflamas are in front of, future Saflama and past Saflama. And so zooming in a little bit, you can see here's the fence, and you can still see a little bit of this fence today. Here's the house, and this little shaded area are these stairs. And Saflama, with this picture, she said, let's see if we can get as close to the stairs and this picture as possible and start digging there. So of course, that's possible in a GIS. I was able to take these air photos and geo-rectify them in a GIS, and with a pretty good level of accuracy, put that into a high precision GPS, and we came to this spot here, and there's actually a little depression back here, and we looked around, and sure enough, we actually found the wood burning stove from the house. So we're quite confident that where we're excavating here is actually this spot right here. And so in the top layers, we're still analyzing the material, and we've gone down deeper than this. This is just the beginning. We're super thrilled to be doing this. Saflama was sitting there with us for part of this. We actually found a dime from the early 1950s, which she claimed she lost and wanted back. But you know, the top layer is certainly the archaeology of her childhood, and we're now, the middle layer has some really early historic material in it, and we're now in the layers that predate Saflama's life and perhaps the lifetimes of her great-grandparents. And we're going to continue this summer to enlarge these excavations and go down. But what I really wanted to do is just share with you some of the work that we're doing. And I only have limited time, and there's lots more I could talk about, but I wanted to make sure also that I have some time for questions. So I think I will stop it there. And I would just also like to acknowledge again and thank Saflama with gratitude and love for entrusting all of us to do this work at her home. And thank you very much.
Darcy, thank you. That's just what an amazing resource of historical opportunity there. Just it's yeah. We are tight on time, but a few questions if you have a moment. The one was about you used a term for the soils. I believe in addition to terra preta for the Amazon, was there a
Dark earths,
dark earth perhaps,
or anthracol.
And there was a follow-up on that. Do you have any either readings or film resources that you could recommend to people that wanted to learn more about dark earth? And
Yeah, so you could just go on Google and find a real wealth. There's a real proliferation of Amazonian sort of terra preta research. So you can, if you go on Google Scholar, you can find dozens and dozens of articles about this. And just a regular old Google, you can find lots of sources for that are less technical. So yeah, I think I don't have one source in mind. There are so many that it's pretty easy to find.
Great. And there was a question: did the indigenous peoples fertilize the soil with fish at all? Do you have evidence of that practice?
We don't have evidence, but we know that it was practiced historically, and not so much with the blue camas, but we know berry gardens were fertilized that way. And so we have another graduate student in our lab who's actually doing her doctoral work on berry gardens, and so the soil chemistry and soil composition of those berry gardens is part of that as well. So we would expect to potentially find some signatures of that. The difficulty, of course, is that there's the temporality of this. So we know that like nitrogen sticks around for a time. We don't know how long, but it certainly doesn't stick around as long as phosphorus. Calcium sticks around for longer. So the signature of these places, just like the ecological attributes of them changes through succession and time, so too do the soil characteristics. So that's why we are really taking a multiple perspectives to these and not just relying on one methodology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Switching topics a little slightly. The question: to study human environment relations in a complex ecosystems, how do you approach research with an archaeological mindset while crediting indigenous oral histories? How often does research from other scientists or archaeologists ignore indigenous oral histories?
That is a really fantastic question, and that's something that that I really learned I had some very generous community teachers, including before I met Saflama. My PhD work actually looked at Coast Salish burials, in particular burial cairns, these above ground arrangements of rock and soil. These are very they're sacred places, and a typical archaeological perspective, of course, would be to excavate them and look at them that way. And so in doing that work, of course, there's no way I would do that. It's completely forbidden. But at the same time, the communities that I was working with, they wanted these places recognized and acknowledged, and they wanted a set of tools to recognize what is a burial cairn versus not. And so what I did is working with the community and working with cultural workers, particularly people who do a lot of funerary work, and they are also the people that do a lot of work with archaeologists. So I knew them in that professional context as archaeologists even before I did my PhD. I worked with people in those communities, explained what I'm doing. They knew the purpose was to identify and protect and differentiate a real burial from a not a burial. And so what I did is with their permission and in consultation with these cultural workers, I built a series of protocols in terms of how people structure funerary space, how families structure your funerary space, and actually use those to then create a series of research hypotheses. So for example, we know that that burials are always placed out of direct line of sight, but never too far away. So there's a threshold there. And so I actually did like visibility studies, like view shed analyses, and actually found that sure enough, that these burial sites often are peripheral to villages, and they're out of sight, but just barely out of sight. And that really speaks to this Coast Salish relationship with their ancestral dead. They want their dead close, but not too close. And so in this kind of work, we're doing the same kind of thing. Suthlema says, here's how we dug the roots. You know, we use digging sticks and so on. And so we actually are using that to then generate hypotheses that are more familiar to us in science. So we're using, but we're also following the rules and the protocols of respectful work. And we use those as, we call them our guiding principles or our guiding values. So that's the short answer to a very complex question.
Yeah. And again, what an amazing opportunity to have Suthlema on site. Just, yeah. Just a couple more. One was, you mentioned a shell-less midden, and you know, what is that, and how does one identify a shell-less midden if there aren't shells that we think of?
So, you know, I've worked as an archaeologist in BC for my whole professional life, and I'm one of those gray-haired archaeologists now, and there's a bunch of us who have been doing this for long enough now, and these shell-less middens, that's what we call them. We know they're cultural. But how do you identify them? We don't actually have a quantifiable list, but we all know them when we see them, right? So we have this sort of dispositional knowledge of what this is. It's black, it's charcoal rich. You rub your hands in it, your hands are stained with charcoal. It's kind of got a greasy feeling, which tells us something about the makeup of, like, the structural makeup of the grain size and so on. But the thing is, we see often. We often see shell midden sites, and the shell middens are typically where people are dumping shell and other materials, fish bones and stuff, out of their houses. Oftentimes, we think that they're actually terraforming and creating platforms for drainage. The houses themselves, of course, are absent of that material because they don't want to be walking on shells. They keep their house floors nice and clean, and they're compacted. But what we see halos around these village sites where similarly there's actually very little shell. And so one of the things we're trying to do is actually, in Emma's work, is actually try and find out where that halo of dark earth ends. And what we're finding is a really, really fine gradation that the dark earth really doesn't end nice and neatly. And that the practices and the things that people were doing in a village, bringing charcoal, bringing nutrients to the soil, I'm sure people recognized at some point that because the houses, sometimes the villages were abandoned and they moved houses somewhere else, and then they would come back and build houses again. This site that we're looking at now, I think actually is probably about 2,000 years old. We haven't radiocarbon dated yet, but I have some really, it's the type of site that screams about 2,000 years ago, maybe 1,500 years ago in my life, or in my mind, my experience. We're going to radiocarbon date this summer. But the point is that the soil there is super productive. And this is something that the people doing research in Terra Preta, they think that similarly in Amazonia, that the houses themselves produce these really rich soils by people bringing charcoal and all these nutrients, and also, you know, leaving nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, you know, through excrement, and then fertilizing also night soil, that kind of thing. And then people realized that at first the effect was unintentional, and then people started replicating that on a much bigger scale intentionally. So we're wondering if a similar model was playing out here. If that's the case, these dark earths that we're seeing, which are ubiquitous across the Northwest coast, and sometimes as archaeologists, we draw a little polygon on a map of where the shell midden is, but this halo of dark earth is much larger. If we can test to what degree that is cultural, then all of a sudden that may actually redefine, may have some pretty significant implications in terms of identifying archaeological sites in British Columbia, and also by extension, what is or isn't protected under our heritage legislation. So that's another really big complex question, but I think Emma is really doing some really neat work in that regard.
Yeah, it makes total sense. And then I'll just end quickly with a simpler one. What is the current land ownership and access to the islands?
Oh, thank you. I can't believe I missed that. And actually, yeah, it's so obvious to me that I often even forget to mention it. Good question. So almost all of Tl'ches is reserve land. So the Songhees own it. And there's just the southern part of the southernmost island is Provincial Marine Park. But again, there's one little campground there that's only accessible by boat. So very few people go ashore. So in a highly urban, densified place like Victoria, it's not quite like Vancouver, it's more like where you live. But this is our last best chance to look at a Lekwungen landscape that isn't bisected by sewer lines and streets. This is the opportunity here is phenomenal, and so we have a long list of research questions, and this is really our best shot to do it. There's nobody who lives there right now.
Yeah, it's just amazing. So,
Yeah,
thank you so much for sharing your research and doing your research and your time. I want to put a quick plug that next week our guest will be Marco Hatch, and so he'll be also talking on some similar research related to the clam gardens and whatever. Dr. Matthews, thank you so much. Wonderful.
Thank you for the invitation to be here, and thank you all for spending some time to hear what I have to say. Thank you.
Great. Good day.
Good day.